The morning it happened, the ground shook before anyone saw a thing. It started as a vibration in the soles of your shoes, the kind of tremor that makes you look down before you think to look up. The stray dogs of Sunnyside Trailer Park felt it before any human did. Three of them were lazing in the pale morning dust near the front gate when their ears went flat against their skulls, and they scrambled under the nearest car, whimpering, pressing their bellies into the gravel. Birds lifted off the telephone wires all at once. A sudden black scatter against the white California sky. Then the sound arrived. It rolled down the narrow, cracked road of Sunnyside like something geological, like a fault line giving way under the weight of too many years. Low at first, almost below hearing, more feeling than noise. Then it built and kept building until it wasn't just sound anymore, but pressure, a wall of mechanical thunder moving at speed toward a cluster of rusted trailers and broken down lives on the eastern edge of Bakersfield, California. 40 Harley-Davidson motorcycles riding two abreast in tight, disciplined formation turned off the main road and came down that narrow lane like a river changing course. Chrome caught the morning sun and threw it in every direction. The riders wore heavy leather cuts, black denim, and expressions that had never once in their lives required explanation. They rolled to a synchronized stop in front of one particular trailer. A single wide with cardboard patching a broken window and a small concrete step that was slowly sinking back into the earth. The engines idled for exactly 3 seconds, a synchronized mechanical heartbeat that rattled the trailer's aluminum siding. Then on no visible signal, they cut out. All 40 at once. The silence that followed was the loudest thing the residents of Sunnyside Trailer Park had ever heard. A girl of 12 stood at the chain-link fence at the edge of her small dirt yard and watched all of this with dark, steady eyes. Her left cheekbone was the color of a storm cloud, purple-black and swollen so badly that the eye above it was reduced to a squinting slit. Her lower lip was split and crusted. She moved carefully with the stiff economy of someone guarding cracked ribs, each breath shallow and deliberate. Her name was Eli Mitchell, and 3 days ago, everything in her small, carefully managed world had come undone. But we need to go back before we go forward. We need to understand who Eli Mitchell was before the ground shook. Because the story of that Monday morning doesn't make sense unless you understand the Friday afternoon that made it necessary. Bakersfield sits in the southern end of the San Joaquin Valley like something the rest of California forgot about on purpose. The heat there is not the glamorous heat of Los Angeles beach cities or the dry, romantic heat of the desert. It is a working heat, industrial and indifferent, the kind that rises off asphalt and presses down from a white sky simultaneously so that you are cooked from both directions at once. In summer, the temperature routinely exceeds 110 degrees, and the air carries the smell of oil fields and fertilizer and the exhaustion of a town that has been grinding itself down for decades without ever quite breaking through to something better. Eli Mitchell had lived her entire 12 years inside that heat. The Sunnyside Trailer Park occupied a rectangular patch of dirt and gravel on the eastern edge of town, bordered on one side by a concrete drainage channel and on the other by the service road that ran behind a row of auto parts stores. The name Sunnyside was a cruel joke that nobody in the park had found funny for a long time, if they ever had. The trailers were mostly single wides from the 1970s and 80s, their original colors long since beaten into a uniform pale gray by decades of sun and alkali dust. The yards were small and mostly without grass, decorated instead with plastic lawn chairs in various stages of collapse, rusted barbecue grills, and the occasional ambitious garden bed that had started with optimism and ended with dried stalks. Eli and her mother Carol lived in a single wide at the north end of the park. It had 2 bedrooms in the technical sense, meaning there were 2 rooms small enough to feel claustrophobic with a bed in them. The window in the kitchen had a crack running diagonally across it that Carol had covered with a strip of clear packing tape 3 years ago and then simply stopped seeing. The front step was a poured concrete block that had been slowly subsiding into the earth for as long as either of them could remember, so that the door now required a slight lift and a sharp push to open from the outside. Carol Mitchell was 31 years old and looked 43. She worked double shifts at the Route 99 Diner, a roadside institution 6 miles west on Highway 99, that had been feeding truckers and locals since 1967. She left the trailer at 5:30 in the morning and returned at 9:30 at night on most days, moving through the door with the particular careful silence of a woman who has learned to occupy as little space as possible. Her hands smelled permanently of industrial bleach and burnt coffee, the knuckles dry and cracked despite the lotion she applied every night before sleep. She was not a complaining woman. She was not a defeated woman. But she was a tired woman in the particular way that only comes from carrying everything alone for too many years without rest or relief. Eli understood this without ever having been told. She understood it the way children understand things that are never spoken aloud, through the architecture of silences and small gestures, through the way her mother paused for exactly 3 seconds with her hand on the door handle every morning before she went out, as if steeling herself against the specific weight of another day. So Eli Mitchell had constructed over her 12 years a survival strategy of remarkable sophistication for a girl her age. The core principle was invisibility. At Millbrook Middle School, where she had attended since 6th grade, she had refined this to something close to an art form. She sat in the middle rows of every classroom, never the front where teachers called on you, and never the back where the dangerous boys congregated. She ate her free lunch, which the school issued on a pale green tray with a small laminated card that had to be swiped through a reader at the register in the far corner of the cafeteria near the emergency exit. She kept her backpack on her lap rather than hanging it on the chair back so it couldn't be taken or rummaged through. She wore clothes that were clean but colorless, washed so many times that whatever patterns or graphics they had once displayed had surrendered to a uniform faded gray. Her sneakers were held together with strips of duct tape along the left toe box and right heel, and she had long since stopped being embarrassed about this because embarrassment requires a witness, and Eli Mitchell did not have witnesses. She was not without intelligence. Her teachers, on the rare occasions they considered her at all, noted that her written work showed a quiet, careful mind. She read above her grade level, absorbed information efficiently, and had a particular aptitude for noticing things. Small details, inconsistencies, the gap between what people said and what they actually did. But none of this manifested in class participation or raised hands or any of the conventional signals by which a school system identifies a capable student. Eli Mitchell expressed her intelligence primarily through the quality of her survival, and that did not translate to a grade. The apex predator of Millbrook Middle School was a boy named Bryce Langdon. Bryce was 13, already broad through the shoulders in the way that some boys get early, deceptively early, so that they move through the world of 12 and 13-year-olds with the physical authority of someone 2 years older. His father, Richard Langdon, owned a chain of automobile dealerships that stretched across Kern County, and this fact had given Bryce not just money, but a specific kind of confidence that money produces in the absence of any other character development. He arrived at school each morning in the passenger seat of his father's Range Rover, which Richard drove himself, partly because he enjoyed it, and partly because the sight of the vehicle pulling up to the curb sent a message that Bryce appreciated having sent. Bryce's primary associate was a wiry, mean-eyed boy named Devin Pruitt, whose function in the relationship was to laugh at everything Bryce said and to amplify any cruelty Bryce initiated by adding his own small, vicious flourishes. The third member of their orbit was Garrett Finch, bigger than the other two, and slower in all the ways that mattered, who served primarily as physical presence and occasional muscle. These three boys had established dominance over Millbrook Middle through a combination of Bryce's confidence, Richard's wealth, and the particular cowardice of institutional systems that reflexively protect the children of powerful parents. Principal Hartwell, who had spent 22 years in school administration by learning which conflicts to have and which to carefully avoid, understood intuitively that Richard Langdon was the kind of father who could make his professional life extremely difficult. And this understanding had quietly shaped every decision he had ever made involving Bryce. Eli understood all of this. She did not resent it exactly. She had come to regard it as a law of nature, like the heat or the cracked step on her front door. It was simply the physics of the world she lived in. You navigated around Bryce Langdon the way you navigated around any fixed obstacle. carefully, without drawing attention to the act of avoidance. Then on a Tuesday morning in the third week of October, the principal walked a new girl into Mr. Calloway's homeroom, and the fixed geography of Millbrook Middle School shifted. Her name was Danny Davidson. She was 12 years old, and she stood beside Mr. Calloway's whiteboard with the posture of someone who had learned through specific and repeated instruction from a difficult world to make herself small. Her shoulders were drawn forward and slightly up, not hunching exactly, but tense the way a person stands when they have learned that the space between a relaxed shoulder and a blow can be very small indeed. She wore heavy-duty combat boots that had been resoled at least once, black jeans with a small tear at the left knee, and an oversized leather jacket that was visibly too large for her. The sleeves rolled twice at the wrists, the shoulders falling halfway to her elbows. The jacket was old, the leather cracked along the collar in both front panels, but it had been cared for, conditioned, and cleaned the way you care for something that belongs to someone else. Her hair was dark and fell forward over one eye in a way that might have been stylish in a different context. And in Danny Davidson's case was clearly functional, a curtain, a small architectural privacy. She was moved to the empty desk 2 rows behind Bryce Langdon and directly beside Eli Mitchell. As she walked down the aisle, Bryce leaned back in his chair and sniffed the air in an exaggerated theatrical way, his face arranged in the expression of someone who has encountered something unpleasant. Devin Pruitt, reading the signal, made a quiet gagging sound. Garrett Finch grinned without fully understanding why. Danny Davidson did not look at any of them. She sat down, pulled her backpack onto her lap, and fixed her eyes on the whiteboard with an intensity that suggested she was reading something extremely important on the blank white surface. Eli watched this from 2 feet away and said nothing. But she noted it. She noted the tightness in Danny's jaw when Bryce made his noise. She noted the way Danny's hands, which were resting on top of her backpack, were pressed flat against the canvas with a deliberate, controlled pressure, the knuckles whitening slightly before she released them. She noted that Danny's eyes were dry and her expression was level, and that she gave absolutely nothing away to the room. Eli recognized all of it. It was her own survival strategy reflected back at her from someone who had clearly been running it longer and under harder conditions than she had. Over the following 2 weeks, Bryce Langdon found in Danny Davidson a new primary target. The campaign was familiar in its mechanics. It started with ambient cruelty, the kind that leaves no marks, and is impossible to report a foot extended into the aisle as she passed, a whisper audible to the 3 surrounding desks, but not to the teacher commentary on her jacket, her boots, her hair. The smell Bryce claimed to detect whenever she was nearby, which he described with the creative specificity of a boy who had been doing this long enough to develop a vocabulary for it. Danny Davidson responded to none of it. She walked through Bryce's campaign of cruelty like a person walking through weather. She went to class. She did her work. She ate lunch alone at the end of a table near the windows. She did not seek allies or report incidents or ask for help. But Eli Mitchell, who sat 2 feet from her for 6 hours a day, noticed the thing that nobody else in the building thought to look for. Under her desk, where the teacher couldn't see and Bryce couldn't see, Danny's hands shook. Not violently, not the trembling of someone in crisis, but with the fine continuous vibration of a person managing a very large quantity of something very difficult. Eli watched her press her palms flat against her thighs to stop it, and watched it return when she lifted them, and watched her press them down again, and said nothing, and looked away, and returned to the careful, cultivated practice of her own invisibility. This continued for 2 weeks. Eli Mitchell watched and said nothing, and went home each evening to the trailer on the north end of Sunnyside, and helped her mother with the dishes on the night she came home early enough to cook and read her library books, and kept her head down. She was not a coward. She had not decided to be indifferent to what was happening beside her. She had simply made the calculation that every person living near the edge of a precarious situation makes the calculation that intervention has a cost, and that the cost in her specific case would be paid not just by her, but by her mother, who could not afford the currency in which those costs were denominated. Then came the afternoon of Friday, October 19th, and the calculation changed. The bell for end of school had rung at 3:15, And the student body of Millbrook Middle was moving in the usual way, loud and directionless, toward the double doors and the bus loop and the pickup line where the Range Rovers waited. Eli was at her locker working on a stuck zipper on the front pocket of her backpack, and this small mechanical difficulty was what kept her inside the building 3 minutes longer than usual, which was what allowed her to hear what she heard. It came from the corridor that branched left toward the old gymnasium, a wing of the building that had been partially decommissioned when the new athletic facility was built 6 years ago, and was now used primarily for storage and as an unsupervised dead zone that develops in every large institutional building where foot traffic is low and adult supervision is effectively zero. She heard Danny Davidson's voice. She heard it crack. The sound of a voice cracking under pressure is a specific and unmistakable thing. It is not a shout, and it is not a cry. It is the sound of a controlled surface breaking the sound of something that has been held very tightly coming apart at a precise point of stress. Eli had heard her mother's voice make that sound exactly once on a night 3 years ago that she did not allow herself to think about in any detail. And the acoustic memory of it lives somewhere in her chest, in the architecture of her nervous system, in a place that bypassed all rational calculation and went directly to the muscles of her legs. She dropped her bag. She walked toward the old gym. Behind the main building on the blind side, away from the bus loop and the teacher parking lot, in every functional window in the school, a narrow strip of cracked asphalt ran between the brick wall and the rusted chain-link fence that bordered the drainage channel. The afternoon sun hit this strip at a flat angle this time of year, throwing long shadows from the fence posts across the broken pavement. Eli came around the corner of the building and stopped. Bryce Langdon had Danny Davidson's canvas backpack held high above his head, one hand at his arm fully extended, keeping it just out of reach while Danny jumped for it with both hands, her face tight with a fury that was barely containing something much more desperate underneath. Devin Pruitt stood to the left, laughing with the relaxed pleasure of someone watching entertainment he has paid for. Garrett Finch stood to the right, looking at his phone with the detached boredom of a hired hand between tasks. The backpack swung. Something inside it shifted. Bryce lowered it slightly curious and reached in with his free hand rooting around and his fingers closed around something wrapped in a bandana near the bottom of the bag. He pulled it out, unwrapped it. It was a pendant on a heavy silver chain. The pendant was cast metal roughly 2 inches across, shaped as a winged skull. The death's head insignia worked in heavy relief, the wings spread wide. It was old, the silver darkened with age and handling, worn smooth along the highest points of the relief, where fingers had touched it repeatedly over years. Eli Mitchell, standing at the corner of the building, saw it clearly. She had seen that symbol before. She had seen it on television and news stories and documentaries her mother sometimes watched on Friday nights when she wasn't too tired. She knew what it meant. She knew what kind of men wore it and what kind of life surrounded it and what kind of organization it represented. She understood, in the way that 12-year-old girls who have grown up paying close attention to the world understand things exactly what was dangling from Bryce Langdon's fingers in the afternoon light. She stood at the corner of the building for a long moment. She thought about her mother's face. She thought about the cracked window and the sinking step and the pale green lunch card. She thought about the very specific and carefully maintained distance she kept between herself and situations exactly like this one. Then Danny Davidson hit the ground. She had lunged for the pendant, and Bryce had shoved her a flat-palm, two-handed push to the sternum that sent her stumbling backward over her own boots and down onto the cracked asphalt on her palms and knees. The impact made a sound. She made a sound. Not a cry, she was past the point where she would allow herself that, but a short, controlled exhalation of pain and shock, and something that was not quite humiliation, but was adjacent to it. The sound of someone who has been made to collide with the ground and knows that other people are watching it happen. Bryce raised one foot over the pendant. "Hey!" The word came from Eli Mitchell's mouth with an authority that surprised her even as she was producing it. It was loud, clear, and carried the particular acoustic quality of a word spoken without hesitation, which is to say it carried no visible fear, even though every cell in her body was currently organized around the single purpose of reversing the last 10 seconds and being anywhere else on Earth. She was already walking forward by the time all three of them turned. She positioned herself between Bryce and Danny without looking at either of them, which is to say she was looking only at Bryce, and she held out one hand behind her palm up toward Danny, who had not yet risen from the ground. "Give her the necklace," Eli said. Her voice shook once at the end of the sentence on the word necklace, a slight audible tremor that she couldn't prevent and didn't try to hide. Bryce stared at her for a long moment with the particular expression of someone encountering something they don't have a category for. Then his face rearranged itself into something more familiar, the slow smile of a boy who has just identified an opportunity. "You serious right now?" Bryce said. "The trailer park girl is playing hero." Devin Pruitt made a sound that was half laugh and half something uglier. Garrett Finch put his phone away. Behind Eli, Danny Davidson had taken her extended hand and was pulling herself to her feet. Eli felt her weight shift as she found her balance. She didn't look back. "Give it back," Eli said again. Bryce tossed the pendant to Devin, a casual one-handed throw that Devin caught with a grin. Then Bryce stepped forward and hit Eli in the face. It was a heavy looping punch, thrown with the full rotation of Bryce's shoulder, landing high on Eli's left cheekbone with a sound like a bat hitting a fence post. The world went white. Eli hit the asphalt with her shoulder first, then her hip, then the side of her head, the impact spreading through her in a wave that she registered as heat rather than pain in that first instant. She lay there for a fraction of a second with the white light pulsing behind her eyes and the taste of blood spreading across the back of her throat, copper and warm. Then a boot connected with her left side just below the armpit, with enough force to drive the air completely out of her lungs in a single ragged rush. The pain that came with this was different from the first pain, sharper and more insistent, radiating outward from the impact point in waves that made breathing immediately complicated. She curled. She pulled her knees toward her chest and tucked her chin and put her arms over her head, the automatic physical grammar of someone absorbing punishment they cannot stop. "Eli." Danny's voice closed and sharp. Another kick lower this time across her lower back. She made a sound she would not have made if she'd had any air left to control it. Then a different voice, adult and loud, bounced off the brick wall from somewhere behind her. Coach Dunbar's voice, recognizable even through the ringing in Eli's ears, carrying the specific angry bafflement of a grown man who has come around a corner and found something he wasn't expecting. "What in the hell is going on here?" The pressure around her immediately dissipated. She heard footsteps retreating on the asphalt, the shuffle and scrape of sneakers trying to look casual, while moving quickly away from the scene of something. Eli uncurled slowly, pressing one hand against the ground to push herself up, and took her first real breath in what felt like a long time. It hurt considerably. She sat on the asphalt with her legs out in front of her and touched her face experimentally with the tips of her fingers and felt the immediate tender swell of her cheekbone and the warm wet of blood on her lip. Danny was crouching beside her. She had found the pendant which Devin had dropped when the coach's voice sounded, and she had it closed in her fist so tightly that the chain trailed between her fingers and her knuckles had gone completely white. Coach Dunbar looked at the scene. He looked at the three boys now standing at the far end of the asphalt strip with elaborately innocent expressions. He looked at Eli, bloody and sitting on the ground. He looked at Danny. He looked back at Bryce. The arithmetic in Coach Dunbar's face was not a long calculation. "Everybody in the principal's office," he said. "Now." Principal Hartwell's office smelled of old carpet and institutional air that has been recycled through too many heating and cooling systems for too many years. There were 4 chairs arranged in front of the principal's desk. Eli sat in one holding a plastic bag of ice wrapped in a paper towel against her face. Danny sat in the chair beside her, her backpack on her lap, the pendant somewhere inside it now, the chain tucked carefully away. Bryce, Devin, and Garrett arranged themselves in the 2 remaining chairs and the standing space beside them with the relaxed physicality of people who are not worried about this particular room. Principal Hartwell looked at the 5 children in front of him and did the same arithmetic Coach Dunbar had done, but came to a different answer. He was a man who had survived 22 years in school administration, by developing an extremely refined sensitivity to the gradient of institutional risk. He knew without having to consult any document or make any phone call that Bryce Langdon's father had written the largest single check in the history of Millbrook Middle School's booster fund not 14 months ago. He knew that Richard Langdon sat on 2 community boards and was personally acquainted with the district superintendent. He knew that the Mitchell girls' file noted financial hardship in a single-parent household and a history of academic underperformance that could, in the right framing, be read as instability. Eli Mitchell Principal Hartwell said fighting on school grounds is a zero-tolerance offense. He paused, shuffled some papers on his desk. Bryce has indicated that you initiated the physical altercation. He was stealing from her, Eli said. Her voice was flat and without inflection, not aggressive, just precise. She tried to get her property back and he pushed her down. I told him to stop. Hartwell looked briefly at Danny, who was watching him with dark, steady eyes. He looked away first. Given the circumstances in your record, Hartwell said, I'm issuing a 3-day out-of-school suspension effective immediately. He said it the way a man says something he is not proud of, but has decided to do anyway. Then while Eli was still absorbing this, Hartwell reached for the phone on his desk and dialed a number from memory. He turned slightly away as it connected. Richard Hartwell said into the phone, Sorry to call on a Friday afternoon. Just wanted you to know there was a small incident today. Bryce is fine, completely fine. Yes, I don't want you to hear about it secondhand and get the wrong impression. Eli listened to this with the bag of melting ice pressed against her cheekbone and said nothing at all. They walked out of the school together into the flat orange light of the late afternoon. The buses were gone. The pickup line was gone. The campus was quiet in the way that schools go quiet after hours, a specific institutional silence with its own particular quality. They walked in silence for a minute. Then Danny stopped. She reached into the front pocket of her backpack and opened her fist. The pendant lay in her palm, the winged skull catching the low sun, the silver dark and worn and solid. I'm sorry, she said. Her voice was level, but something in it had changed from what it was inside the school. Some layer of the controlled surface had come down. You shouldn't have done that. He hurt you because of me. Eli looked at the pendant. She had a clear and specific memory of the moment she had recognized it standing at the corner of the building with the perfectly reasonable option of walking in the other direction still available to her. It looked important, she said. Danny closed her fingers around it again. Her jaw was tight. It's my dad's, she said. He gave it to me when we came down here. Said it would keep me safe. She paused. Didn't exactly work out. Where is your dad? Eli asked. Oakland, she said. He's coming down this weekend. He had to stay to handle some things first. She looked at Eli directly for the first time since they had left the building, and Eli found that her eyes were a specific shade of dark brown that was almost black, and contained in them the particular quality of someone who has seen things a bit earlier in life than the schedule normally provides. What's your address? Danny asked. Eli told her. Danny nodded once, turned, and walked toward the motel district without another word. Eli watched her go for a moment, then began the long walk home to Sunnyside. The weekend was a specific kind of misery. Carol Mitchell came home that Friday night to find her daughter at the kitchen table with a swollen face and a suspension notice, and the particular stillness of a girl who was trying to pre-absorb the impact of what is coming. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, still in her diner uniform, the smell of industrial bleach and burnt coffee mixing with the trailer's usual air of old carpet and outside heat. Then she put down her bag and sat across from her and listened while Eli told her what had happened. She cried, not loudly, not for long, but in the quiet, sustained way of a woman for whom crying is not a dramatic act, but simply the body's management of what the mind cannot hold. Then she dried her face with the back of her wrist and was silent for a while. Things are going to be fine, she said finally, about herself as much as her daughter. She did not blame Eli. She understood what her daughter had done, and even at some level understood why. But she also sat across the table from the undeniable math of an unpaid shift and a suspension that meant Eli could not be alone in the trailer, and she could not leave her, and the cost of that math was going to fall on them in the form of days of groceries that would need to stretch further than they were designed to. Eli said, "I could not do it, Mom." Carol Mitchell looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she stood up and moved around the table and sat beside her and put her arms around her, gently avoiding the left side. And they sat like that in the small trailer while the night sounds of Sunnyside came in through the crack window and the trucks rumbled past on Highway 99. Saturday passed. Sunday passed. Monday morning arrived with the particular low flat light of a California October, pale and dry. The sun not yet high enough to generate heat, the ground still cold from the night. Eli was sitting on the concrete front step, which had sunk another imperceptible fraction of an inch since the last time she had thought about it, watching a plastic grocery bag drift across the dirt lot on a breath of wind when she felt it. The vibration came first, through the soles of her sneakers, through the concrete step, up through the bones of her legs. The stray dogs went first, ears flat, scrambling under vehicles gone. Then the birds. Then the sound. Eli Mitchell stood up slowly, her ribs pulling with the movement, and walked to the chain-link fence at the edge of the yard and looked down the narrow road toward the main street. They came around the corner two abreast in tight formation, the way a military unit moves when it wants its movement itself to constitute a message. 40 of them. The sound was not just noise but pressure, a wall of it, and the chrome caught the morning light and threw it everywhere. And the patches on their backs were visible even at distance, the winged death's head, the arc of letters reading Hell's Angels above it, and below it, the single word, Oakland. They filled the street. They rolled to a stop directly in front of Eli's trailer with the precision of people who have discussed in advance exactly where they intend to stop. The engines idled for exactly 3 seconds. Then they cut. All 40, at once. The silence was enormous. The man on the lead bike was the largest human being Eli Mitchell had ever seen outside of a television screen. 6.5 feet tall, constructed on a scale that seemed to have been designed for a different set of physical laws. His leather vest was covered in patches, 20 years of accumulated history pressed into embroidered cloth and painted leather. His face was weathered in the particular way of someone who has spent decades in weather. The skin mapped and seamed, the eyes behind it permanently narrowed from years of sun and wind. He swung off the road king with a deliberate, unhurried movement, pulled off his sunglasses and scanned the trailer park. His eyes moved across the doors and windows without hurry, without particular expression. Then they found Eli Mitchell at the fence. Behind him, stepping down from the back of a bike ridden by a wiry, heavily scarred man, was Danny Davidson. She pointed at Eli with one small finger. The large man walked toward the fence. His boots crunched each step of gravel with the sound of something final. He reached the gate, unlatched it with one hand without looking down, and walked into the yard. He stopped in front of Eli. He looked at the girl for a long moment. Then he crouched, the leather creaking with the movement, bringing himself level with the 12-year-old's eyes. His hand came up large and calloused, and very gently, he took Eli's chin and turned her face to the side, examining the bruise that had spread across her cheekbone in 3 days from dark purple to a deep greenish black. "You're Eli," he said. His voice was a low, continuous sound, like a river moving over stones. Eli nodded. "I'm Jim Davidson," the man said. "People call me Big Jim. I'm Danny's father." He did not release Eli's chin for another moment, studying the bruise with the careful attention of someone who was filing the information permanently. Then he let go. He stayed crouched. "My daughter tells me you stepped in front of 3 boys bigger than you," he said. He spoke slowly, each word given its full weight. "She tells me they hit you because you wouldn't move. She tells me they took something of mine and you told them to give it back." Eli said they were hurting her. Jim Davidson looked at her. The cold assessment in those eyes shifted slowly, like something in deep water turning replaced by something with more heat in it. "Yeah," Jim said. "They were." He stood. He turned and looked at the single-wide trailer, the cardboard in the window, the sinking step. He looked for a long time, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Then he turned back to Eli. "Go get your shoes," he said. The front door of the trailer came open with a bang, and Carol Mitchell stood on the step in a bathrobe, holding a baseball bat in both hands, her face white and tightly controlled. "Get away from my daughter," she said. She had both hands on the bat and her feet planted, and her voice was steady, and Jim Davidson looked at her for a moment and then raised both hands palms out in a gesture of complete and visible peace. "Ma'am," he said. His voice dropped to something quieter without losing any of its weight. "Put the bat down. I mean, you and your girl, no harm on this earth." Carol's eyes moved from the man to the bikes to Danny, who gave a small, careful wave from behind the scarred man's shoulder. "She's suspended," Carol said. She lowered the bat 2 inches. "The school made a mistake," Jim said. "One we're going to go correct right now." He met her eyes, and something passed between them that was not warmth exactly, but was its functional equivalent, the recognition of one person by another as someone who can be trusted with the truth. "I give you my word, ma'am. No harm comes to your girl today. Or any day." Carol Mitchell looked at her daughter. Eli looked back at her. "Go get your shoes, Eli," she said quietly. 5 minutes later, Eli Mitchell was on the back of Big Jim Davidson's Road King. Both hands wrapped around the passenger bar, the engine shaking the world beneath her with a low, continuous roar that she felt in her teeth. 40 bikes fell into formation around them. Carol Mitchell stood in the yard with the baseball bat loose at her side watching. The convoy moved out of Sunnyside and turned onto the main road toward Millbrook Middle School. Traffic stopped. Drivers stared. People on sidewalks turned to watch. A patrol car coming the other direction slowed to observe and then continued on, perhaps deciding that whatever was happening here was above a certain threshold of situational complexity. Eli Mitchell sat on the back of that motorcycle in her duct-tape sneakers and her faded clothes, with her split lip and her storm cloud cheekbone and her cracked rib that pulled with every breath, and felt something move through her that she did not have a precise word for. It was not triumph. It was not relief. It was something quieter than either of those things, something more like the sensation of a pressure that has been so constant for so long that you have stopped registering it as pressure suddenly releasing. She had spent her entire life being invisible. For the first time in that life, she was not. The school appeared in the distance, the sprawling brick face of Millbrook Middle, and through the windshield of every car on the road and the windows of every classroom on the side of the building that faced the street faces were appearing. Teachers, students, a custodian who stepped out of a side door and stood on the steps with a broom in his hand and his mouth open. 40 motorcycles swung into the drop-off zone of a public middle school and came to a synchronized stop, and the sound they made when they cut their engines, all 40 at precisely the same moment, was the loudest silence Eli Mitchell had ever heard. Big Jim swung off the bike and stood in front of the school's main entrance. He put on a pair of reading glasses, heavy silver frame ones, with the deliberate, unhurried manner of a man who has never once in his life been in a hurry because the world has always waited for him. He looked at the building. He looked at the faces in the windows. "All right, Eli," Jim said. "Let's go have a conversation about your education." The hallway of Millbrook Middle School had never been quiet like this before. It was a building accustomed to a specific kind of noise, the layered institutional chaos of 800 adolescents moving between classes, lockers slamming sneakers, squeaking on linoleum, the overlapping frequencies of 100 simultaneous conversations. Even between periods, even in the early morning before the first bell, there was always some ambient level of human noise that the building seemed to generate on its own, the way old structures settle and creak. Now there was nothing. The hallway was a ghost town of fluorescent light and waxed floors, and the only sounds were the heavy measured footfalls of Big Jim Davidson's boots, striking the linoleum with the patient regularity of something that was not going to stop. Jim walked at the center of the corridor, Eli on his left and Danny on his right. Behind them came Uncle Roe, the wiry, scarred man who moved with the coiled efficiency of someone who had spent decades making himself useful in situations that required a specific kind of usefulness. Roe carried a thick manila envelope under one arm with the casualness of a man carrying his lunch. 6 other bikers followed them into the building, and arrange themselves in the hallway outside the main office with the practiced stillness of people who understand that standing still in a specific way is its own form of communication. The remaining 33 stayed outside with the bikes. The main office reception area was a room designed for exactly 2 or 3 people at a time. It had a low-drop ceiling, indoor-outdoor carpeting in a shade of gray that had been chosen to hide dirt and had succeeded by becoming indistinguishable from it, and a long desk behind which the school secretary, a woman named Mrs. Faber, who had worked this desk since the second Bush administration, sat with both hands flat on her keyboard and her eyes moving between the door and the phone with the expression of someone calculating the geometry of a problem that has no clean solution. "Good morning," Jim said, removing his sunglasses and folding them into his vest pocket. He smiled at Mrs. Faber with the careful politeness of a man who knows that his size and appearance have already done the aggressive part of whatever message he is delivering, which means he can afford to be courteous. "We're here to see Principal Hartwell regarding Eli Mitchell's suspension." Mrs. Faber found her voice. "Mr. Hartwell is in a meeting," she said. "He can't be disturbed." "I'm sure he'll want to make an exception," Jim said. He continued smiling. Mrs. Faber reached for the phone. Before she completed the gesture, the door to the inner office opened, and Principal Hartwell stepped out, moving with the purposeful efficiency of a man who has just been informed by his intercom that something requiring his attention has arrived in his reception area. He had a coffee mug in his right hand and the expression of someone who has pre-assembled a professional response to whatever the situation is and is ready to deploy it. He saw Jim Davidson. The coffee mug hit the floor. It shattered on the indoor-outdoor carpet, the handle spinning away toward the baseboard, the coffee spreading in a dark, irregular shape across the gray. Hartwell stood very still and looked at the large man filling his reception area and did not immediately speak. "Mr. Hartwell," Jim said pleasantly, "my name is Jim Davidson. This is my daughter, Danny, and this is Eli Mitchell, whose suspension I believe we need to revisit this morning." Hartwell's eyes moved from Jim to Eli to Danny and then to the door of his office, performing the rapid spatial calculation of a man assessing exit routes. "Mr. Davidson," Hartwell said. His voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when a great deal of effort is being applied to keeping them that way. "I wasn't expecting you. I think there may have been some miscommunication about the incident on Friday." "No miscommunication," Jim said. He gestured toward the inner office. "Shall we sit down, Ro?" Ro stepped forward and opened the office door with one hand, then stood aside. The gesture had the smooth inevitability of something that has been discussed in advance and is now simply being executed. Hartwell went into his own office. They sat, or rather Eli and Danny sat in the 2 chairs in front of Hartwell's desk, and Hartwell sat behind it, and Jim Davidson stood, because Jim Davidson was the kind of man who instinctively understood that the person who stands in a room of seated people controls the geometry of every conversation that happens in that room. Rose stood near the door. The door was closed. "Here is the situation," Jim said. He spoke slowly and without raising his voice the way a person speaks when they know the words themselves are sufficient and volume would only be redundant. "My daughter was assaulted on school grounds on Friday afternoon. 3 boys attempted to steal property belonging to my family. This girl, Eli, put her own safety on the line to stop it. She was beaten for doing so. And your response to these events was to suspend the victim and the hero, while the boy who initiated the violence went home to his father's Range Rover." Hartwell opened his mouth. "Before you speak," Jim said, "I want to show you something." He nodded at Ro. Ro crossed the room and placed the manila envelope on Hartwell's desk. He did not slide it across or drop it. He placed it with a precision that was itself a form of emphasis. "That folder," Jim said, "contains written statements from 4 students who witnessed the entire incident from the library windows on the 2nd floor. The library overlooks the strip of asphalt behind the old gym where the incident occurred. These 4 students saw Bryce Langdon initiate the physical contact. They saw Devin Pruitt in possession of my family's property after it was taken from Danny's bag. They saw Eli Mitchell position herself between my daughter and 3 boys larger than her and asked them to return what they had taken. And they saw Bryce Langdon throw the first punch. Hartwell stared at the envelope. These statements were collected yesterday, Jim continued, by Roe here, who spent his Sunday afternoon knocking on the doors of students who had the decency to come forward when asked, even though nobody in this building thought to ask them on Friday. He paused. The narrative that Eli started the fight is now officially without any factual support whatsoever. The room was quiet. Outside the closed door, Mrs. Faber's phone rang once and stopped. I wasn't aware of additional witnesses, Hartwell said finally. You didn't look for them, Jim said. He said it without accusation, which made it worse. You didn't look because you already knew what conclusion you wanted to reach, and additional information would have complicated the process of reaching it. Hartwell's hands were flat on his desk. He looked at them. Here is what's going to happen this morning, Jim said. He let the sentence sit for a moment before continuing. First, Eli Mitchell's suspension is revoked effective right now, and it is permanently expunged from her academic record. Not marked as overturned. Gone. Second, Bryce Langdon and his associates received the maximum suspension this district allows for assault and theft. Third, you call Richard Langdon right now on this phone while I am standing in this room, and you inform him that Bryce's behavior on Friday is being addressed appropriately and that his family's financial contributions to the school have no bearing on how disciplinary matters are handled here. Hartwell looked up sharply at the third item. Jim met his eyes without expression. The fourth item, Jim said, is that you do this because it is right, not because I'm standing here, not because of what's in that envelope, because a 12-year-old girl bled on your school grounds for doing the right thing, and the least this institution can do is acknowledge that. Silence. Hartwell looked at the envelope. He looked at Eli, who was sitting very still in the chair with her ruined cheekbone and her split lip and her careful, watchful eyes. He looked at Danny beside her. He looked at Jim Davidson, who had not moved and was not going to move. Hartwell reached for the phone. He made the call to Richard Langdon while Jim stood 3 feet away and listened to every word. The conversation was brief and on Hartwell's end, precisely what Jim had specified. When Hartwell hung up, he looked like a man who has just completed a transaction he cannot reverse. The suspension is revoked, Hartwell said. I'll have the records updated before noon. Jim nodded once. He picked up his reading glasses from where he had set them on the edge of the desk and tucked them back into his vest pocket. Thank you for your time, he said, and there was nothing in his voice that sounded like gratitude and nothing that sounded like threat. Just the tone of a man closing a meeting that has concluded as expected. They walked back out through the reception area where Mrs. Faber had not moved from her position behind the desk and down the hallway and out the double doors into the October morning, where 33 bikers stood among their machines with the patient stillness of men who have been waiting and expected to wait and are content with this. Eli stood on the top step of Millbrook Middle School in her duct-tape sneakers and squinted into the sunlight with her storm cloud cheekbone and her cracked rib, and watched the bikers adjust their gear and reach for their helmets, and felt something in her chest that she did not immediately identify, because it was not a sensation she had extensive experience with. It was the feeling of a wrong thing being made right. It was simple and enormous simultaneously. Come on, Jim said beside her. I know a place on 3rd Street that does eggs and does them correctly. You're going to be late for second period, which is fine because I am going to call it a field trip. They took up 4 booths at a corner diner on 3rd Street, the bikers filling the place from wall to wall, the other customers paying their checks with unusual efficiency and departing. The waitress, a woman in her late 50s who had clearly seen everything the world had to offer and had formed her own conclusions about all of it, took their orders without any visible reaction to the population currently occupying her section and brought coffee with the efficiency of someone who understands that large groups require a different operational tempo. Jim sat across from Eli and ate scrambled eggs and drank black coffee and asked Eli about school, about what she liked and what she didn't about her mother, and how long they had been in Bakersfield, about whether she had any interest in engines or mechanics. He asked with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who is genuinely interested in the answers, which was its own kind of disorienting experience for a girl who had spent her life being invisible. Eli answered, carefully at first, then more directly. She talked about her mother and her double shifts in the diner on Highway 99. She talked about the library and the books she checked out twice a week because the trailer's walls were close, and books made the distance between walls feel larger. She did not talk about loneliness or about fear or about the specific weight of being 12 and poor in a world that had organized itself around the opposite of both of those things. But Jim Davidson, eating his eggs across the booth, absorbed all of it from what Eli did say, and Eli could see him doing it and did not mind. Danny sat beside her father and ate pancakes and did not say much, which was not unusual, but she watched Eli in a way that had changed from the way she had watched her in class, the constant, vigilant scanning of a person assessing threats, replaced with something quieter and more settled. They dropped Eli at school in time for second period. Jim walked her to the door, shook her hand in the formal way that some men shake the hands of young people as a specific form of acknowledgement, and said, "You need anything, Danny knows how to reach me." Then 40 motorcycles left the parking lot of Millbrook Middle School and turned onto the main road and were gone, and the school returned to its usual physics, and Eli Mitchell went to second period algebra with a bruised face and an expunged record, and the particular quality of calm that descends on a person after a storm has passed, and the ground is still there. The weeks that followed occupied a different register from everything that had come before them. The news of what had happened moved through Millbrook Middle School with the speed and thoroughness that only institutional gossip achieves the story, passing from student to student in the hallways and the cafeteria, and the bus loop growing in some details and contracting in others, but retaining its essential shape. 40 bikers had come to the school. They had gone into the principal's office. Bryce Langdon had been suspended for 2 weeks, and Eli Mitchell had come back the same day with her suspension removed. And the reason for all of it was that Eli had stood between Bryce and the new girl and taken a beating rather than walk away. Bryce Langdon, upon returning from his suspension, did not look at Eli Mitchell. He did not look at Danny Davidson. He moved through the hallways with his eyes aimed at a point approximately 6 inches above the floor, and did not speak unless spoken to by a teacher, and the specific kind of confidence that Richard Langdon's money had built in him over 13 years appeared to have undergone a structural failure from which it was not recovering on any observable timeline. Devin Pruitt and Garrett Finch, also suspended, also returned diminished. The social architecture that had made them satellites of Bryce's gravity collapsed when Bryce's gravity disappeared, and they rearranged themselves into a quieter orbit without apparent distress. The rest of the school population, which had operated for the past 2 years, under the assumption that Bryce Langdon's dominance was a fixed and permanent feature of their environment, recalibrated. In the specific way that adolescent social systems respond to the removal of a coercive center, the air pressure in the hallways simply changed. People breathed differently. Eli and Danny began eating lunch together at the table near the emergency exit that Eli had occupied alone for 2 years. This was not the result of a conversation or an explicit agreement. It happened the Monday after Eli's reinstatement, when Danny carried her tray to Eli's corner and sat down across from her and began eating, and Eli moved her library book 6 inches to the left to give her table space, and that was the totality of the negotiation. They walked home together after school on most days. On some of those days, a motorcycle would be idling at the curb when they came through the double doors. Uncle Roe most often, sometimes Jim occasionally, one of the other Oakland chapter members whose names Eli was gradually learning. They would ride back to the trailer park, and sometimes Danny would come in and sit at the small kitchen table, while Carol on her early nights made dinner. And the kitchen felt less like a box and more like a room. Carol Mitchell, who had gripped a baseball bat on her front step with white knuckles 3 weeks earlier, had recalibrated as profoundly as anyone. The fear had not disappeared exactly. It had been reorganized, reclassified from threat to something she did not have an existing category for, and was slowly building one. When Jim Davidson appeared at the trailer park on a Saturday afternoon 3 weeks after the school incident, it was not to deliver any message or make any request. He had brought 2 other club members, and they spent 4 hours replacing the cardboard in Carol's kitchen window with a proper pane of glass and repairing the door frame so that it no longer required the specific combination of lift and push to open. And when Carol offered to pay them, they looked at her with the polite incomprehension of people who have not understood the question. "You're under the family shield now," Carol Jim had said, accepting a cup of coffee that Carol had made the way she always made it strong enough to hold a spoon upright. "Your girl took something for Danny that Danny shouldn't have had to take. That creates an obligation. We don't let obligations sit." The autumn moved through Bakersfield in the way autumn does in the San Joaquin Valley. Less a season than a slight softening of the summer, the temperatures dropping into the 80s by mid-October, and the evenings becoming cool enough that you notice the change only in contrast to what had come before. The almond orchards east of town let go of their leaves, and the drainage channels ran with brown water after the first October rain. And the Route 99 diner put up its annual Thanksgiving banner above the counter, and Earl Kowalski ordered an extra case of canned pumpkin. Earl Kowalski had owned the Route 99 diner since 1989. He was 67 years old, moved with the deliberate care of a man whose knees had been providing feedback about his life choices for the better part of a decade, and possessed the particular stubborn vitality of someone who has identified the thing that gives their days meaning and has organized everything else around its continuation. The diner was that thing. It was not profitable in any spectacular sense, but it was consistent. It served its community. It employed 8 people, including Carol Mitchell and Earl, considered these facts more than sufficient justification for its existence. The trouble started in the second week of December. It began small enough that it initially registered as the random misfortune that any small business absorbs as a cost of operation. A power outage that lasted 14 hours over a Tuesday and Wednesday and cost Earl a refrigerator full of perishables. A broken window on the back door that someone had apparently thrown a rock through sometime between close of business Saturday and opening Sunday morning. 2 of his employees arrived on a Thursday morning to find the tires on their cars slashed in the diner parking lot. Earl reported these incidents to the Bakersfield PD, who took notes with the practiced efficiency of a department that has long since learned to manage the gap between its resources and the volume of minor commercial crime in an industrial city. A patrol car came out each time a form was completed each time, and nothing happened each time. Then the power was cut. Not outage, but cut the main service line to the building severed at the junction box in a way that required an electrician in 3 days to repair. Earl paid. He absorbed it. He told himself it was bad luck running in a cluster, which happens. Then 2 men came into the diner on a Tuesday night 30 minutes before closing, when there were 2 customers left, and Carol was the only staff member on the floor, and sat in the far booth and ordered coffee, and did not drink it, and stayed until Earl had to ask them to leave. And on their way out, one of them paused at the door and said, without looking at Earl directly, that this was a good little place, and it would be a shame if something happened to it. Earl called his attorney the next morning. His attorney made some inquiries and called him back that afternoon with the name Warren Pruitt. Warren Pruitt was 54 years old and had been developing commercial real estate in Kern County for 22 years with a business philosophy that could be summarized as the aggressive acquisition of undervalued properties through whatever combination of incentive and pressure was most efficient in a given situation. He had built strip malls, storage facilities, chain restaurant pads, and budget hotel clusters across the Southern Valley. And he had done this by identifying properties whose owners were either motivated to sell or could be made motivated, and then applying the appropriate pressure to close the gap between those 2 categories. The lot that the Route 99 diner sat on was as real estate significantly more valuable than the business it was hosting. Pruitt had been watching it for 2 years and had recently secured preliminary interest from a national fast casual restaurant chain that wanted a Bakersfield presence, which had sharpened his timeline considerably. Earl's lease on the land had 3 years remaining. Earl would not agree to an early buyout at the price Pruitt was offering. So Pruitt had moved to the second phase of his standard operating procedure, which was to make the current use of the property untenable through incremental disruption until the occupant's cost-benefit analysis shifted. Carol Mitchell found out about Warren Pruitt on a Thursday evening. Earl sat her down after the dinner rush and explained the situation with the careful honesty of a man who feels he owes the people who depend on him the truth about their situation. He showed her the letter from Pruitt's attorney. He explained what his own attorney had told him about their options, which were limited by the reality that Pruitt had been careful enough to ensure that none of the incidents so far could be directly connected to him through evidence that would survive scrutiny. "I don't know how long I can hold on," Earl said. He was sitting across the table from her in the booth nearest the register, and he looked every one of his 67 years. "The repairs are eating through my reserves. If he escalates or if the health department gets involved, I don't have a buffer." Carol drove home that night on the road she had driven 1,000 times and did not see any of it. She sat in the driveway of the trailer park for 4 minutes after she turned off the engine in the dark with her hands in her lap. Then she went inside. Eli was at the kitchen table with her library book when Carol came in. She looked up and saw her mother's face, and the book went down. Carol told her. She did not soften it. She was not a woman who had ever had the resources to maintain a version of reality softer than the actual one for her daughter's benefit, and she had long since made peace with the particular kind of honesty this required. She told her about Pruitt in the letter and what Earl had said about his reserves, and she told her what it would mean if the diner closed, and she told her she would find another job, that there were other jobs, that they would be fine. She was looking at the table when she said it. Eli looked at her mother's hands flat on the table in front of her. She had watched those hands her entire life. She knew their geography. She knew the specific crack that ran across the knuckle of her mother's right index finger that had been there since Eli was 6 and never fully healed because there was no break in the work long enough for it to close. She knew the particular way Carol pressed her palms down when she was managing something she didn't want visible on her face. Carol looked up and was already making the expression that meant she was done with her own difficulty and ready to attend to whatever was in front of her. She found Eli watching her with a look she had not seen on her daughter's face before, or not in this particular configuration. It was the look of someone who has just made a decision. Carol did not ask her about it that night. She made tea, which they drank at the table without saying much, and Eli went to bed with her library book, and Carol sat at the table for another half hour listening to the trucks on Highway 99. The next day was Friday. Eli went to school. She attended 4 classes and ate lunch with Danny and walked home through the pale December afternoon and told her mother she was going to the library to return a book. She went to the library. She returned the book. She checked out 2 others that she did not intend to read this week. Then she got on her bike and rode east. Whispering Pines was a residential development on the northern edge of the city, positioned on a gentle rise that allowed its marketing materials to reference views of the foothills and justify the word pines in the name, despite the relative scarcity of the tree in question in the immediate vicinity. Warren Pruitt had broken ground on the project 14 months ago and was currently in the infrastructure phase. The phase where the land is graded and shaped and the systems that will eventually live under the finished surface are installed. It was, in terms of site activity, the noisiest and least aesthetically resolved stage of any development project, characterized by heavy equipment, raw earth, and the kind of visible disruption that makes the finished product seem nearly impossible. Eli rode past the entrance twice before she identified the thing she was looking for: the service road that ran along the northern perimeter of the site, away from the main entrance, and the construction office trailer where Pruitt's project manager operated. She followed it on foot, pushing her bike through the scrub alongside the fence line. She spent that Friday evening and the following Saturday and Sunday observing. She was not sure what she was looking for, only that she had decided to look. That looking was the specific thing available to her that was not available to adults who had more visible stakes in the situation and therefore less freedom of movement. A 12-year-old girl on a bicycle near a construction site was scenery. She was not a threat. She was not a liability. She was, in the context of Warren Pruitt's operational calculus, invisible. She was good at invisible. What she found over those 3 evenings was a pattern. The main construction activity stopped at 5 o'clock, when the equipment operators and the day laborers departed, and the site settled into a twilight quiet that lasted until approximately 9 in the evening. At 9 on each of the 3 nights, she watched a convoy of unmarked dump trucks arrive via the service road. three or four of them moving without headlights until they were well inside the perimeter fence, at which point they would stop at a specific point along the northern edge of the site at a place where the graded earth dropped away into a natural drainage depression that Eli could see from her position outside the fence, and they would dump. The material was dark, darker than the pale sandy soil that characterized the site. It was almost black in the truck lights, and it moved slowly, reluctantly, in a way that dirt usually does not, with a viscosity that suggested it was not only dirt. Eli watched this 3 times. She did not know exactly what it was, but she understood in the specific way that a child who has spent her entire life paying close attention to the gap between what things appear to be and what they actually are understands things that it was not what it was supposed to be, and that the fact that it was happening at 9 o'clock at night on an access road on the far side of the site from the project office meant that this was not something anyone was meant to see. She had her phone. It was a prepaid model that Carol had given her for emergencies, with a cracked screen and a camera that took functional, if not artistically distinguished, photographs. She took 47 photographs over 3 evenings, some of the trucks, some of the dumping activity, some of the depression in the earth where the material was being emptied. On the following Monday, she went to the school library during her free period and printed 11 of the clearest images at 10 cents each, which cost her $1.10, which was money she could afford because she had $3.40 remaining from the 5 she had been given 2 weeks ago for a field trip that had been canceled. She put the photographs in a manila envelope that she found in the recycling bin outside the copy room. She wrote nothing on the outside of the envelope. She put it in her backpack. After school that Monday, she told Danny she had an errand and couldn't walk home. Danny looked at the backpack and then at Eli's face and said nothing, which was one of the things about Danny Davidson that Eli had come to understand was a specific form of intelligence, the ability to know when a question would not improve a situation. She rode to the compound. The steel gate at the entrance to the Oakland chapter's property was closed. Eli pressed the buzzer and looked directly at the camera, which she had learned on previous visits was the appropriate protocol. The gate slid open after 30 seconds, and Uncle Roe was standing on the other side with a look of surprise that he managed to keep calibrated to the moderate range. Eli Roe said, "Where's Danny?" "Went home," Eli said. "I need to talk to Jim. It's about something important." Roe looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped aside and said, "Come on." The main room of the clubhouse building was large and low-ceilinged, with exposed rafters and walls covered in the accumulated history of the chapter photographs, patches, plaques, and the kind of objects that accrue around men who have been doing the same thing together for a long time. Jim was at the oak table that dominated the center of the room, going through paperwork, a pair of reading glasses on his face that made him look simultaneously more domestic and more improbable than usual. He looked up when Eli came in, took off the glasses, and set down his pen. "Eli," he said. He read her face the way he had read it on the first morning, with the immediate, efficient assessment of a man who has spent decades in situations where reading a face correctly was a prerequisite for continued existence. "Sit down. What's wrong?" Eli sat. She placed the manila envelope on the table between them. Then she told Jim everything, about Pruitt and the diner and Earl's reserves and her mother's face at the kitchen table Thursday night. She told it clearly and in the right order, which was not the order she had experienced it in, but the order that made the most logical sense, because Eli Mitchell, even at 12, understood that the way you tell a story determines what the listener is able to do with it. When she got to the photographs, she opened the envelope and laid the prints on the table one by one. She explained what she had seen, where and when and how many times, and what had struck her as wrong about it, even though she did not know the specific vocabulary for what she was looking at. Jim picked up the photographs one by one. He did not speak while he looked at them. His expression did not change. He went through all 11 prints with the careful attention of a man who is not just looking at what is in front of him, but simultaneously running a parallel calculation about what it means and what it implies. He set the last one down. He looked at Eli for a long moment. "You went out there 4 nights in a row by yourself to get these," Jim said. Eli answered, "The first night I just went to look. The pictures came after." Jim leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. He looked at the photographs spread across the table. He looked at the girl sitting across from him, 12 years old in her faded clothes and her duct-taped sneakers, with the photographs she had taken herself on a crack-screen prepaid phone, laid out with the seriousness of an investigator presenting evidence. Something moved through Big Jim Davidson's face that was not quite any single identifiable emotion, but contained several of them in a specific combination. Pride was in there. Something older and quieter than pride was also in there. The recognition of a quality he had spent decades valuing and rarely found fully formed and had not expected to encounter in a 12-year-old girl from a trailer park in Bakersfield. He reached for the intercom on the wall beside the table and pressed the button. "Ro," he said, "get in here and bring your laptop." Ro appeared in the doorway 40 seconds later with a laptop under his arm and a look that said he had been expecting to be called. Jim tapped the photographs on the table. Whispering Pines Development North Site Perimeter. Late-night dump trucks, unmarked 9 o'clock operation. I need to know what's going in that drainage depression, and I need to know who's signing off on the site's environmental compliance reports. Rose set the laptop down and pulled up a chair and began typing. He worked with the focused efficiency of a man who knows exactly where to go for the information he needs and has long since stopped finding it remarkable that he knows these things. It took him 40 minutes. What he found was this: the Whispering Pines development had generated in the process of its excavation, ingrading a substantial volume of soil classified under California Environmental Code as Category 2, contaminated material, primarily petroleum hydrocarbons, from an industrial site that had occupied the land previously. The lawful disposal of this material at a licensed hazardous waste facility 3 counties away would have cost Warren Pruitt's development company approximately $3 million. The cost of dumping it into an unlicensed depression on the north perimeter of a site where a junior environmental compliance inspector named Dale Whitman had been signing off on falsified soil purity reports was approximately $90,000, representing the total of 7 wire transfers from a Pruitt Company subsidiary to a shell entity registered in Nevada that shared a mailing address with Dale Whitman's brother-in-law. The drainage depression where the trucks were dumping fed via subsurface flow into a secondary groundwater recharge zone that supplied approximately a third of the aquifer servicing the residential areas east of the development. Rowe read all of this aloud from his screen in the calm, factual voice of a man delivering a weather report. Jim listened without moving. When Rowe was done, Jim was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Federal." EPA Rowe said, "Clean Water Act, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. The wire transfers bring in wire fraud. The inspector kickbacks add bribery of a public official." He paused. He's looking at 20 years if someone with the right paperwork walks into the right office. Jim nodded slowly. He looked at the photographs. Then he looked at Eli. "You understand what you found," Jim said. Eli said, "I understood it was wrong. I didn't know it was that wrong." Jim almost smiled. "It's about as wrong as things get," he said. He straightened in his chair. "Rowe, make 3 copies of everything. Original package goes to our attorney for a dead drop. 1 copy here. 1 copy travels with me tomorrow." Rowe was already moving. Jim looked at Eli across the table. "You did right coming here," he said. "You did right going out there on your own first." He paused, and the weight of what he said next was carried not in its volume, but in its deliberateness. "Your mother is not going to lose that job, Eli. I promise you that." Eli looked at the man across the oak table, at the weathered face and the cold, careful eyes that were at this particular moment aimed at her with something that was not cold at all. She nodded. "Go home," Jim said. "Tell your mother to go into work tomorrow like nothing's changed. Tell her Earl should do the same. Leave Warren Pruitt to us." Eli rode home through the December dark on her bicycle, the cold air coming off the valley floor, pressing through her jacket, and she was not cold. Something was burning in her chest, something that had started as anger on Thursday night at the kitchen table and had been refined over 4 nights on a bicycle outside a fence line into something cleaner and more purposeful than anger. She had done what was available to her to do. She had paid attention, and she had acted on what she saw, and she had brought what she found to the people who could use it. She had not waited to be rescued. She had not sat at home and hoped the problem would resolve itself. She had done the thing that was hers to do, and now the rest would follow. She pulled into Sunnyside as the night settled fully over the valley, the trailer park quiet around her, and she locked her bike to the fence post and went inside. Her mother was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold in front of her. She looked up when Eli came in. "You went to see Jim," Carol said. Eli sat down across from her. She told her what she had found and what she had done and what Jim had told her to do. She told her clearly, and in order the way you tell a story when you need the listener to be able to act on it. Carol Mitchell listened. When Eli finished, Carol looked at her daughter for a long moment across the small table in the small kitchen of the trailer on the north end of the Sunnyside trailer park. She reached out and put her hand over Eli's. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Richard Langdon came to the compound the following evening. He drove himself alone in the Range Rover, and he sat outside the steel gate for 4 minutes before pressing the buzzer, which Roe observed on the camera monitor, with the focused attention of a man watching something he wants to remember accurately. When the gate opened and Richard walked in, he was carrying a manila envelope of his own thick, and he held it the way people hold things they intend to use as leverage and have just realized may not function in that capacity. Jim was at the oak table. He did not stand when Richard came in. Richard set the envelope on the table without being invited to sit and said, "I want to know what it would take to make this go away quietly." Jim looked at the envelope. He did not touch it. "That depends," Jim said, "on what you think is in there." "Money," Richard said. His voice had the specific quality of a man who has spent his professional life conducting transactions and believes at some cellular level that every human interaction is a transaction if you identify the correct currency. Enough to make the situation with the school disappear. Enough for the Mitchell girl. Enough for you to consider the matter closed. Jim was quiet for a moment. Around the table, 3 other club members who had been present when Richard arrived were very still in the way that men are still when they are paying close attention. "Richard," Jim said finally. He said the name the way you say the name of someone you have just decided you understand completely. "I don't sell silence. I don't take money for justice. And I especially don't take money from a man who raised a boy to believe that money is what justice costs." He pushed the envelope back across the table. "Here is the only currency I accept," Jim said. "Tomorrow morning at 8:30, you will drive your son to the front steps of Millbrook Middle School in that Range Rover. You will both get out. Bryce will stand in front of Eli Mitchell and Danny Davidson and look them in the eye and say that what he did was wrong and that he is sorry. And then you, Richard, will look Carol Mitchell in the eye and you will tell her that you are sorry for raising a boy who put his hands on her daughter." Richard's face moved through several expressions in rapid succession. The one it settled on was the one men settle on when they have realized they are in a negotiation they cannot win. "That's humiliating," he said. "Yes," Jim agreed, "it is." He let that sit for a moment. "But it's the only offer on the table and it expires when you walk out that gate. If you don't appear tomorrow morning, the documentation Roe has assembled about your dealership's title practices goes to the state attorney." He paused. "Take the envelope with you, Richard. I don't want your money. I want your son to learn that some things cost more than money can cover." Richard Langdon picked up the envelope. He stood for a moment looking at Jim Davidson across the oak table in the clubhouse of the Oakland Hells Angels, and whatever further argument he had been constructing did not survive contact with what he saw in Jim's face. He left. He did not say anything else. He appeared the next morning at 8:27, Bryce in the passenger seat, both of them in the kind of silence that fills a vehicle when everything necessary has already been said the night before, and nothing remains but the execution. The apology happened on the steps of Millbrook Middle in front of enough of the student body to constitute a public record. Bryce cried, which surprised no one who understood the specific pressure that had been applied over the preceding 24 hours. He stood in front of Eli Mitchell and Danny Davidson on the school steps with the morning light flat and cold on his face and said that what he had done was wrong and that he was sorry and he said it to Eli directly. And Eli listened with the same still watchful quality she brought to everything. And when he was done, she nodded once without speaking, which was the appropriate response, and Bryce understood it as such. Richard did not cry. He stood in front of Carol Mitchell, who had come at Jim's quiet suggestion and said what Jim had told him to say, and Carol listened with the still composed attention of a woman who has waited a long time for something and has decided to receive it with dignity rather than with anything that could be mistaken for weakness. When it was over, Richard walked back to the Range Rover without looking at anyone. Bryce followed him. They drove away. Eli stood on the steps and watched the vehicle until it turned out of the lot. Danny stood beside her. He didn't mean it, Danny said. Eli thought about this for a moment. Doesn't matter, she said. He said it. Warren Pruitt played golf the way he conducted business, with the absolute confidence of a man who has arranged all the variables in advance and considers the actual execution a formality. He was on the 9th fairway of the Bakersfield Country Club at 10:15 on a Tuesday morning, the December sun still low enough to be kind as drive straight down the center, cut his second shot, leaving him a comfortable approach to the green. His two companions, a city councilman named Gerald Marsh and a bank executive whose institution had provided the construction financing for Whispering Pines, were walking the fairway behind him with the relaxed gait of men who play golf on Tuesday mornings because their lives have been arranged to permit it. Pruitt was thinking about the diner. His man had confirmed the previous evening that the operation was proceeding on schedule. Earl Kowalski's reserves were nearly exhausted. The most recent repair bill for the electrical service restoration had consumed the last significant buffer the old man had. Another 2 weeks of targeted pressure, and Kowalski would be calling Pruitt's attorney to discuss terms. The lot would transfer. The chain restaurant deal would close. The whole sequence would conclude with the clean inevitability of a properly structured transaction. He was addressing his approach shot, the club drawn back, his weight transferring in the practice way of a man with a 12 handicap, when the ground began to vibrate. He stopped. He looked down at his feet, the manicured grass of the fairway perfectly still around his shoes. The vibration intensified. Gerald Marsh, 30 yards behind him, stopped walking and looked toward the tree line that bordered the eastern edge of the course. The bank executive stopped beside him. Both of them had the expression of people trying to locate the source of a sensation they have not previously encountered on a golf course. The sound arrived a fraction of a second after the vibration, the way thunder follows lightning, the gap between them indicating proximity. It came from behind the stand of eucalyptus trees along the service road that ran parallel to the 3rd and 9th fairways, and it built in the way that sound builds when the source of it is moving towards you and not going to stop. 12 Harley-Davidson motorcycles came through the gap in the tree line, where the service road crossed the cart path and turned onto the 9th fairway. They did not use the cart path. They rode directly onto the grass, the heavy tires of 12 full-dress motorcycles pressing deep into the expensive Kentucky bluegrass that the club's grounds crew spent 40 hours a week maintaining, leaving parallel tracks in the turf that would be visible from the clubhouse windows and would require immediate attention and would be a source of conversation in the pro shop for the remainder of the season. They spread as they came, the formation opening from 2 abreast to a wider configuration that covered the fairway from rough to rough, and they rode straight at the putting green where Warren Pruitt was standing with his 9-iron and his approach shot, and the particular expression of a man watching something move toward him that he has no framework for processing. They surrounded the green, the engines cut, all 12 within 2 seconds of each other. The silence on the 9th fairway of the Bakersfield Country Club was the kind of silence that contains a great deal of information if you are paying attention to it. Big Jim Davidson swung off his Road King and stepped onto the putting green. His boots left deep, clean impressions in the soft grass with each step, and he walked toward Warren Pruitt with the unhurried directness of a man who has never in his adult life been required to hurry because the thing he was moving toward was always going to be there when he arrived. Pruitt's 2 companions had already begun a quiet lateral movement toward the nearest golf cart. Gerald Marsh, who had been in local politics long enough to develop a refined sensitivity to situations that could appear in a photograph in an unflattering way, moved with particular efficiency. "Do you know who I am?" Pruitt said. He had recovered enough from the initial shock to assemble a version of his usual authority, the voice of a man who owns things and expects this fact to be understood and respected. His face was flushed, but his jaw was set, and he held the 9-iron with both hands in a way that was not quite a threatening gesture, but occupied the same general territory. Jim stopped 4 feet from him. He looked at Pruitt with the calm, complete attention of a man who has assessed the situation in advance and found it to contain nothing that requires adjustment. "I know exactly who you are," Jim said. "Warren Pruitt, developer. You've been operating in Kern County for 22 years. You have a project called Whispering Pines currently in infrastructure phase on the north end of the city, and you have been systematically harassing a 67-year-old man named Earl Kowalski to force him off a piece of commercial property you want to redevelop." Pruitt's jaw worked. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, "and I'm going to need you to get your vehicles off this fairway before I call the club manager and the police department." Jim reached into his leather cut and removed a manila envelope. He held it at his side for a moment, not offering it, just holding it with the patient ease of a man who knows the value of what he's carrying. "Call whoever you'd like," Jim said. "While you're doing that, I want to show you something." He held the envelope out. Pruitt did not take it. Jim turned slightly and nodded at Uncle Roe, who had dismounted and crossed the green, and now took the envelope from Jim's hand, opened it, and removed the top photograph. He held it in front of Pruitt's face at a distance of approximately 18 inches. Pruitt looked at the photograph. His color changed. It was a clear image taken on a cracked screen prepaid phone by a 12-year-old girl lying on her stomach outside a chain-link fence at 9:15 on a December evening of 3 unmarked dump trucks backed up to the edge of a drainage depression on the north perimeter of the Whispering Pines development site. Their beds raised dark material flowing in a slow, heavy stream into the ground. Rowe produced a second photograph, then a third. The 9-iron came down. Pruitt's hands were no longer interested in holding it. "Category 2 contaminated soil," Jim said. "Petroleum hydrocarbons from the previous industrial site. The legal disposal cost, according to the licensed hazardous waste facility in Fresno that you contracted with on paper and then stopped using, is approximately $3 million. What you've actually been paying is considerably less routed through a Nevada shell company to a compliance inspector named Dale Whitman, whose brother-in-law has an interesting arrangement with your subsidiary." Jim paused. "The drainage depression you've been using feeds a groundwater recharge zone that supplies residential wells east of your development, which elevates this from a disposal violation to something that involves the Clean Water Act and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and given the wire transfers, the federal wire fraud statutes." Pruitt was very still. The flush had left his face entirely, replaced by a pallor that was not white exactly, but the particular color of a man watching the architecture of his life, developing visible structural failures in real time. Rowe held up the remaining photographs in a loose fan the way a card player displays a hand. "What do you want?" Pruitt said. His voice had changed completely. The authority was gone, the tone that expected things, and what was left was quieter and more honest, and considerably more frightened. "How much?" Jim shook his head once, a small motion barely perceptible. "I don't want your money," he said. "I want you to leave Earl Kowalski alone. I want you to leave the Route 99 diner alone. I want the harassment to stop today, meaning the power outages and the vandalism, and the men you send to sit in the booths at closing time. All of it stops today." Pruitt stared at him. "You're doing all this over a diner," he said. "I'm doing this because a woman named Carol Mitchell works at that diner," Jim said, "and her daughter is under my personal protection, which means Carol is under my protection, which means her livelihood is under my protection." He let the chain of logic sit for a moment in the December air. "Do you understand how this connects?" Warren Pruitt nodded, a small, fast movement. "Here is what's going to happen this afternoon," Jim continued. "You are going to contact your attorney and instruct him to prepare a deed of sale transferring the land beneath the Route 99 diner to Earl Kowalski. The sale price will be $10,000. Fair consideration, clean title, no encumbrances. This will be signed today at your attorney's office before 5 o'clock. Pruitt's mouth opened. The alternative, Jim said, is that Rowe makes two phone calls. One to the field office of the EPA in Sacramento. One to the investigative unit of the state attorney general's office. Both calls will be accompanied by a complete documentation package, including the photographs, the wire transfer records, the shell company registration, and the compliance inspector's employment history. He paused. I have been told that federal environmental cases of this type typically result in asset seizure of all properties connected to the violating entity pending investigation, which would include Whispering Pines and your other current projects. The litigation timeline is measured in years. The potential sentence, if convicted on all counts, is measured in decades. The ninth fairway was very quiet. Somewhere behind the eucalyptus trees, a bird was doing something complicated in the upper branches, the sound of it surprisingly audible in the absence of any competing noise. Warren Pruitt looked at the photographs in Rowe's hand. He looked at Jim Davidson. He looked at the 12 bikers arranged around his putting green on their machines. None of them moving, none of them speaking, all of them simply present in the specific way that makes presence itself into a kind of pressure. He said, "I'll call my attorney." "Good," Jim said. He took the photographs from Rowe and replaced them in the envelope and tucked it back into his vest. "Rowe will ride with you to the attorney's office to make sure the paperwork proceeds efficiently." He looked at his watch. "It's 10:35. You have until 5 o'clock. Enjoy the rest of your round, Warren." He turned and walked back to his motorcycle. The 12 riders started their engines. They crossed the fairway in the direction they had come back through the gap in the eucalyptus trees and onto the service road and were gone. And Warren Pruitt stood on the ninth green of the Bakersfield Country Club with his 9-iron in the grass at his feet and the entire future of his professional life reorganizing itself around a completely altered set of constraints. Rowe stayed. He leaned against a golf cart with his arms crossed and watched Pruitt make the call to his attorney with the patient stillness of a man who has all afternoon and is comfortable with silence. Warren Pruitt signed the deed of sale at 4:47 that afternoon in the conference room of a law firm on Truxtun Avenue. Earl Kowalski's attorney received the executed documents by fax at 4:59 and called Earl at home to confirm. Earl called Carol Mitchell at 5:15, and she had to ask him to repeat himself twice because she couldn't hear him clearly over the sound of what turned out to be Earl Kowalski crying. What Pruitt did not do in the hours between signing the deed and boarding a plane to Los Angeles that evening, because his beach house in Malibu had become suddenly and urgently appealing, was call the crew he had engaged and paid in advance to conduct the final definitive act of property damage that would have left Earl with no practical choice but to surrender. He did not call them because between the golf course and the attorney's office and the airport, his mind was occupied entirely with the reorganization of his professional future, and the specific telephone number of the man who ran the crew was in a phone he had stopped using 2 months ago because he had become worried about call records, and he had not transferred the number to his current device. And by the time he was on the plane and the city lights of Bakersfield were receding below him, he had not thought about the crew at all. The rain came in from the northwest after dark, the kind of December rain that the San Joaquin Valley receives in thin, intermittent bands, not the sustained soaking rain of the Pacific coast, but a series of moving curtains wet and cold and driven sideways by a wind off the valley floor. It slicked the asphalt of Highway 99 to a black mirror and reduced the visibility in the diner's parking lot to a yellow-orange smear of reflected neon. Carol Mitchell was closing alone. The last customer had left at 11. The cook, a man named Doyle, who had worked the Route 99 griddle for 11 years, had finished his cleanup and gone home at 11:15. Carol had locked the back door behind him and begun the closing routine she had performed hundreds of times, the particular sequence of tasks that returned the diner to the condition in which it was ready to open the next morning. Wiping down the counter, refilling the sugar dispensers, rolling silverware into paper napkins for the morning setup. She was thinking about Earl. She was thinking about the phone call at 5:15, the sound of his voice through the static, the way he had said the words, deed of sale, with an amazement that suggested he was still not entirely certain the thing had happened. She was thinking about what it meant, for him and for her and for Doyle and the other staff, and for the regulars who came in on specific mornings for specific things, because consistency is what some people hold on to when other things are less reliable. She was thinking about Eli, who had come home on Monday evening after an errand described only as returning library books, and had sat across from her at the kitchen table and told her with the calm directness of someone much older than 12 what she had found and done, and who Carol was supposed to call about it, and what Jim Davidson had told her would happen. She was smiling, standing at the counter with a damp cloth in her hand, and outside the rain moved in sheets across the parking lot, and the neon flickered once and held. She did not hear the vans arrive. The rain was loud on the roof, and the diesel engines of the three vehicles were below the threshold of the rain's white noise, until they were already in the parking lot, until they had already swung in and blocked the exit, and stopped with the particular aggression of vehicles that are not parking so much as positioning. She heard the doors. She turned from the counter and looked through the rain-blurred window and saw the shapes getting out of the vans. 8 of them in dark hoodies moving with the purposeful looseness of men who have been paid to do a specific thing and are in the process of doing it. 2 of them were carrying something. The rain made it difficult to see clearly, but she knew the shapes of what they were carrying. She took 3 steps back from the counter and reached for the phone. The front window of the Route 99 diner exploded inward. Not all at once, a crowbar struck the lower left corner of the large plate glass window that Earl had replaced twice in the diner's history, the most recent time 6 years ago. And the glass did not simply break, but detonated, the fracture lines racing outward from the impact point in a web that covered the entire pane, before the pane came in a cascade of heavy, irregular pieces that covered the floor of the diner from the front wall to the first row of booths in a layer of glittering rubble. The rain and the wind came in through the opening. Napkins lifted off the counter and scattered. The sugar dispensers Carol had just refilled rattled. The bell above the door, which no longer had a door to hang above, swung on its bracket and rang once. Carol was behind the counter with the phone in her hand, her back against the reach-in cooler, dialing with fingers shaking hard enough to make the numbers difficult. She got the call connected and said the address clearly twice, and then put the phone face down on the counter because the man leading the crew had come through the gap where the window had been and was standing in the diner's dining room with a crowbar in his hand and 5 men behind him. "All right," the man said. He had a thick neck and the flat affect of someone who has done this enough times that the theatrics no longer interest him. "Everybody get back. Nobody does anything stupid, and this is a property matter, not a personal one." His crew fanned out behind him, moving to the booths, beginning the methodical work of destruction that Pruitt had contracted and paid for in advance. I wouldn't, said a voice from the corner. It came from the darkest booth, the last one on the right before the kitchen pass-through, where the overhead light had been burned out for 2 weeks, and the shadows pulled deep enough to make the booth's occupant effectively invisible unless you were looking specifically for someone to be there. The crew leader squinted. The other men stopped moving. Uncle Ro leaned forward out of the shadow and into the dim light of the diner's interior. His forearms on the table, a cup of coffee in front of him that had been sitting long enough to be cold. He looked at the 8 men in the dining room with the expression of a man who has been sitting quietly in a booth for 90 minutes waiting for exactly this. "Evening," Rose said. "You boys are out past your bedtime." The crew leader took 1 step forward and raised the crowbar slightly and was in the process of formulating a response when the sound began. It came from the kitchen. The heavy, swinging double doors with the circular porthole windows pushed outward, and Big Jim Davidson came through them in an apron because he had been in Earl's kitchen for the past 90 minutes eating pie and drinking coffee with 2 other club members and waiting with the patient, well-fed calm of a man who has set a trap and is confident in its engineering. He untied the apron as he walked and set it on the counter. He stood in the aisle between the counter and the booths and looked at the 8 men. 8 was not a large number relative to certain other numbers. The booths along the wall of the Route 99 diner had been occupied since 10 o'clock that evening by 20 members of the Oakland chapter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. They rose now in a sequence that began at the booth nearest the kitchen and moved toward the front of the diner like a wave. The sound of their rising, the creak of leather, and the shift of substantial weight, and the thud of heavy boots finding the floor filling the diner from wall to wall. They stood. They did not move toward the 8 men. They simply stood arranged throughout the space, and the space was now entirely different from what it had been 30 seconds earlier. The geometry of it completely reorganized around the presence of 20 large, still unhurried men who were looking at the crew with expressions that contained neither anger nor excitement, only the flat professional attention of people who have arrived at work. The crew leader looked at Roe. He looked at Jim. He looked at the 20 men between him and the opening where the window had been. He did the arithmetic, which was not complicated. We were just... He started. You broke Carol's window, Roe said. His voice was quiet and without any particular heat, which made it considerably more effective than if it had been loud. You tracked mud on her clean floor, and you scared her. The crew leader took one careful step backward. You can leave, Jim said. His voice was quiet and reasonable, and contained within it the specific quality of a statement that is not an invitation to negotiation. The vans stay. They left. They walked out through the gap in the window frame one by one and got into the vans and sat in the vans and did not start the engines because 3 club members were crouched at each van's wheel wells with the purposeful efficiency of men performing a familiar task. The sound of compressed air leaving tires is not dramatic. It is a slow, definitive hiss, and it continued at all 4 corners of all 3 vehicles for the better part of 3 minutes, during which the crew sat inside and said nothing. Then 2 other club members opened the hoods and applied the crew's own crowbars to the engine compartments with the selective precision of men who know exactly which components to address to make a vehicle non-functional while leaving it otherwise intact. When they were done, the 3 vans sat on flat rubber in the rain-soaked parking lot of the Route 99 diner going nowhere. Inside, Jim Davidson was sitting at the counter with an empty coffee cup, and Carol Mitchell was behind the counter filling it from the pot she had just made, and her hands had stopped shaking, and the rain came in through the gap where the window had been and made the floor near the front of the diner wet. And none of this was ideal, but all of it was manageable. You knew, Carol said. She set the pot down. You knew they were coming. Jim wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Pruitt struck me as a man who operates on momentum, he said. He'd already paid these boys. The deal getting signed this afternoon doesn't automatically stop what was already in motion. He took a long, careful sip. So we made sure we were here. Carol looked at the gap where her window had been. The rain blew in and moved across the floor. You were in my kitchen eating pie for 90 minutes waiting for 8 men to break my window, she said. Earl's pie, Jim said. The Dutch apple. It holds up well. Carol Mitchell looked at this man sitting at her counter in the middle of the night with rain coming through her broken window and 20 of his people standing in her dining room, and she found that she did not have an appropriate response immediately available. So she laughed. It was a short sound surprised out of her, and it had in it something that had been compressed for a long time under the weight of double shifts and single parenthood and cracked windows and sinking steps and all the specific accumulated gravity of a life lived at the edge of what is manageable. A company came the next morning at 7 to measure for a replacement window. They came at 9 to install it. It was not the same kind of glass that had been there before, being considerably thicker, and of a type that the installer described with professional understatement as substantially more impact resistant. The club paid the invoice before Carol saw it. The 3 vans were towed from the parking lot mid-morning. Their owners or the men who had been driving them had not returned. Earl Kowalski came in at 10, as he did every morning, and stood in front of the new window for a long moment without speaking. Then he went behind the counter and put on his apron and started the coffee and began the morning opening routine he had been performing for 35 years, and did not say anything about the previous night or the window or Warren Pruitt or any of it, because Earl was a man who understood that some events are honored best by the simple act of continuing. The December passed. Christmas came to Sunnyside Trailer Park in the limited way that Christmas comes to places where the margin is thin, a wreath on the door of the Mitchell trailer, a string of lights that Carol had found at a thrift store, and that Eli had spent an hour untangling on the kitchen table. The tree was a 3-foot artificial one that had lived in the storage space under the trailer for 4 years and came out slightly more asymmetrical each time. They put it on the kitchen table because there was no other flat surface of appropriate height. Jim Davidson appeared at the trailer on the 23rd with a box of groceries that Carol accepted after a short and principled argument that she lost, and a small package for Eli that turned out to contain a set of professional mechanics tools, the kind with the heavy chrome finish and the satisfying click of precisely engineered components in a molded case that smelled of new rubber. The card inside the case said only, "For when you need them." Eli looked at the tools for a long time after Jim left. She ran her thumb along the handles, the chrome cold and solid, each tool sitting exactly in its molded recess. She closed the case and set it carefully on the shelf above her bed where she kept her library books. The new year came. The weather shifted in the way the valley's weather shifts in January, the cold becoming more consistent, the mornings gray and damp, the afternoons occasionally warm enough to remind you that this was still California and the sun was still there, just operating on a reduced schedule. Millbrook Middle School resumed after the break, and Eli went back to it with the tools on the shelf and the weight of what had happened in December still present in some fundamental way in how she moved through the building, in how she occupied space, and the quality of the stillness she had always had. But that had changed in character from the stillness of someone trying not to be seen to the stillness of someone who has made a series of decisions and is at peace with them. Bryce Langdon came back after the Christmas break, a noticeably quieter version of himself. Whatever reconstitution of ego he might have been working on over the holiday had not yet achieved any visible structural integrity, and he moved through the hallways with the particular caution of someone still assessing which surfaces can bear weight. He did not look at Eli. He did not look at Danny. This was no longer an act of defiance or dismissal. It was simply the behavior of a boy who had learned, through a specific and memorable sequence of events, that his field of vision was healthier and his world was more navigable when it did not include certain people. Devin Pruitt and Garrett Finch had rearranged themselves into something smaller and less threatening than they had been, which turned out to be their natural state in the absence of a more powerful gravitational center to orbit. Spring came to Bakersfield the way it always does. Not dramatically, but incrementally, the temperatures climbing in small steps and the light changing its angle, and the almond orchards east of town putting out their early pale blooms that turned the roadside a color somewhere between white and pink that lasted exactly 2 weeks and then was gone. The days lengthened. The drainage channels dried. The Route 99 diner put up its Easter decorations, a string of pastel eggs that Earl had been using since 1994, and replaced individual bulbs on rather than retire. Carol Mitchell had been named co-manager of the Route 99 diner in February, a title that came with a meaningful increase in her hourly rate and a share of the monthly net that Earl had structured as a partnership arrangement. Because Earl Kowalski was a man who understood that gratitude expressed only in words has a short half-life, and he wanted Carol Mitchell to still be there in 10 years. She was 10 years younger than she had looked in October and moved through the diner with an authority that had been there all along but was now visible because the weight that had been suppressing it had been removed. The sinking front step of the Mitchell trailer had been addressed in late January by a club member named Tully, who arrived unannounced one Saturday morning with a bag of concrete mix and a level, and spent 4 hours rebuilding the foundation until it sat flush and solid. And when he was done, he wiped his hands on his jeans and refused coffee on the grounds that he had another stop to make, which may or may not have been true. The gravel in the Sunnyside driveways had been replenished in March, a truckload of fresh material arriving early on a weekday morning and being spread by 4 club members before most of the park's residents were awake. The local dealers who had previously stationed themselves near the park entrance had been relocated through a series of brief, direct conversations that left no room for misunderstanding and required no follow-up. Sunnyside was not a different place exactly. It was the same collection of aging single-wides and plastic lawn chairs and rusted barbecue grills. But something in its atmosphere had changed the way a room changes when you open a window, not transformed, just relieved of something that had been accumulating. Summer came and went. The school year turned over. Uncle Ro brought the Sportster to the Sunnyside driveway on a Saturday in April of the following year, arriving on the back of a flatbed truck with the bike under a canvas tarp. When the tarp came off, it was clear that the motorcycle had been sitting somewhere for a long time. The chrome was oxidized, the paint faded to a chalky approximation of its original color, the engine open on one side where someone had begun a repair and not completed it. A 1982 Harley-Davidson Sportster, partially disassembled, sitting in the driveway of a trailer park in the morning light, with the battered dignity of something that has not yet decided it is finished. Rose stood beside it and looked at Eli and said, "Carburetor's toast. Primary chain is stretched. Left fork seal is weeping. If you can put it right, we'll teach you to ride it." He left the flatbed, the tools, and a factory service manual that was held together with a strip of electrical tape along the spine. Then he got in his truck and drove away. Eli stood in the driveway and looked at the Sportster for a long time. Then she went inside and got the molded case from the shelf above her bed and brought it out to the driveway and opened it in the afternoon sun. She spent the following 6 months with her hands inside the motorcycle. She read the service manual the way she read library books, completely and with attention before she touched a single component. And then she worked through the machine, systematically learning its logic from the outside in, understanding each system before moving to the next. She used the mechanic's tools from the molded case. She watched videos on the school library's computer. She called Uncle Ro twice with questions, and Ro answered them with the precise brevity of a man who believes that the person asking a question should do as much of the answering as possible on their own. She made mistakes. She corrected them. She spent one entire Saturday with the carburetor components arranged on a clean shop towel in the driveway, working through the fuel delivery problem methodically, and Ro appeared at noon without announcement, looked at the arrangement on the towel, pointed at one specific component without speaking, and left. Eli looked at the component for 10 minutes before she understood what Ro had been pointing at. She fixed it. She did not call him to report this. She understood that reporting was not the point. The work taught her things that were not about motorcycles. It taught her that most complex problems have a logic to them that becomes visible when you slow down enough to look. It taught her that the gap between something broken and something working is almost always smaller than it appears from the outside. It taught her that patience applied to a specific problem is not the same thing as waiting, and that the difference between the two is the difference between making progress and simply enduring. By October, the Sportster ran. She started it for the first time on an afternoon when the October sun was still warm enough to sit in, crouched in the driveway with the choke set and her thumb on the starter button, and the engine caught and fired and settled into the deep rhythmic idle of something that has been correctly assembled from its components. The exhaust note even and authoritative, the vibration coming up through the frame and into her hands and through her arms and into the center of her chest. She sat back on her heels and listened to it run. The sound filled the driveway and reached the neighboring trailers and lifted off into the pale October sky, and it was the most satisfying thing she had ever made with her hands. Carol came out and stood in the doorway of the trailer and watched her daughter crouching in the driveway next to the running motorcycle, 14 years old and 6 inches taller than she had been 2 years ago. Her shoulders broader, her hands stained with the permanent traces of mechanical work that don't fully wash out her face, still carrying the particular watchfulness that it had always had, but wearing it differently now with less apprehension in it and more ownership. She leaned in the doorway and watched for a while without saying anything. Then she went back inside and the sound of the Sportster came through the new window, the thick, impact-resistant window the club had paid for, and she stood at the kitchen counter and listened to it and let it be exactly what it was. The Saturday that Jim Davidson called them to the compound was the 14th of October, 2 years to the week from the Friday afternoon behind the old gymnasium at Millbrook Middle School. The Oakland chapter's compound was full in a way Eli had not seen it before. Every parking space in the yard was occupied, bikes filling the rows with the organized density of a well-maintained collection chrome catching the October light. Smoke was rising from the massive barbecue pit behind the main building, mesquite and charcoal, the smell of it reaching the gate before you could see the source. Music was playing from somewhere low and country, and the sound of men talking. The specific overlapping sound of a large group at ease with each other and with the occasion filled the yard. When Eli and Danny came through the gate, it stopped. Not gradually. All at once, the conversations ending the laughter, cutting off the yard, going quiet, in a way that was not hostile but was deliberate. The kind of quiet that is assembled on purpose by people who have decided that a particular moment deserves it. Eli stopped walking. She looked at Danny. Danny was looking straight ahead, and the corner of her mouth was doing something very small that Eli had learned over 2 years of sitting beside her to read as the suppression of a smile. She nudged Eli forward with her elbow. Eli walked into the yard, and the 50 men in it watched her come, their expressions holding the particular quality of people who are present for something they consider worth being present for. She knew most of their faces by now. She knew names, histories, the specific roles and capabilities that each man occupied within the chapter's life. She knew which of them had fixed her mother's window, and which had replaced the gravel in the Sunnyside driveways, and which one had spent 4 hours on a January Saturday rebuilding the foundation of the sinking front step until it sat level for the first time in her memory. She knew all of them, and they were watching her, and the yard was quiet. Big Jim came out of the main building. He was in his full colors, the complete leather cut with the accumulated patches of 20 years of chapter membership. The winged death's head centered on his back beneath the Oakland rocker, the front panels covered in the ranked insignia of his position. He walked to the center of the yard, and the gravel shifted under his boots, and he stopped and looked at Eli, and the look on his face was the one that Eli had seen developing over 2 years of Saturday mornings and diner breakfasts and late evenings at the oak table. The one that had started as assessment and moved through respect and arrived at something that both of them had been careful in their different ways not to name too directly. Eli, Jim said. His voice carried across the quiet yard without effort, the way it always did. Step up here. Eli crossed the yard. She stopped in front of Jim. She was taller than she had been by 3 inches, and there were 15 pounds of earned muscle in her frame, but she still had to look up at Jim Davidson, who was the kind of man you would probably always look up at. Jim spoke to the yard. His voice was the same even volume, carrying and clear. 2 years ago, on a Friday afternoon, a girl with nothing in her pockets and nobody at her back walked between 3 older boys and 1 smaller girl and told them to stop. He said this without inflection, stating it as simple fact. They didn't stop. They hit her. They kicked her. They left her on the ground. And when they were done, she got up and she walked out of that school with a cracked rib and a face that looked like a storm system. And the first thing she said to my daughter when they got outside was that it was okay. A sound moved through the assembled men. Not quite a murmur, something lower than that, the resonant collective sound of a large group of people processing a specific piece of information in real time. In this chapter, Jim continued, "We live by a code that has exactly 2 requirements." He held up 1 finger. "You stand for what's right when it costs you something to stand." He held up a 2nd finger. "You stand for the people beside you, whatever it costs." He lowered his hand. This girl did both of those things before she knew a single person in this room, before she had any reason to think it would matter to anyone outside her own conscience. She did it because it was right. And because the alternative was to look away, and looking away wasn't something she was willing to do. The yard was absolutely still. The smoke from the barbecue pit drifted upward in a slow column into the October sky. Jim reached behind him. Roe was standing just behind Jim's right shoulder, and he placed something in Jim's hand, and Jim brought it forward and shook it out. It was a vest. Black leather tailored size for a 14-year-old who had been growing consistently for 2 years, and whose dimensions had been. Eli now understood, quietly noted, and communicated to someone at some point along the way. It was not a Hell's Angels cut. The back panel was clean without the death's head or the rocker. But on the front left panel, positioned directly over the heart, was a single embroidered patch worked in white and silver thread on black felt. 2 words in a heavy serifed font, "Blood Protector," and beneath it on a smaller rocker of the same felt family. Eli looked at the vest in Jim's hands. She looked at it for a long moment, at the weight of it, at the careful work of the embroidery, at the precision with which it had been made for a specific person who was standing here now. Then she reached into the pocket of her jacket and took out the key to the Sportster. The worn metal key with the small leather fob that had come with the service manual with the accumulated grime of 6 months of mechanical work pressed into its grooves. She held it in her palm and held it out to Jim. Jim looked at the key. "I don't know how to pay you back," Eli said. Her voice was steady. "For any of it." She paused. "This is the only thing I have that's worth anything." Jim Davidson looked at the key in the girl's outstretched palm for a long time. The yard around them was completely silent. 50 men watching a $12 key held out by a 14-year-old girl in a trailer park driveway of a compound in Bakersfield, as if it were the most valuable object in the county, which at that moment, in the economy of what it represented, it might have been. Then Jim reached out and picked up the key slowly and held it in his closed fist, and stood there with it for a moment that had a specific weight to it, a gravity that the yard felt and absorbed. Then he opened his fist and looked at the key again, and he placed it back in Eli's palm and closed her fingers around it. "The debt between us," Jim said, his voice lower now, meant for Eli rather than the yard, though the yard could hear it perfectly well in the silence, "doesn't exist in the form of things that can be exchanged. It exists in the form of what you've already done and what you're going to keep doing." He paused. "You can't pay it back. You can only pay it forward. And that is exactly what I expect you to do." He held the vest out. Eli took it with both hands. The leather was heavy and cool and smelled of the same combination of oils and age that all the cuts in this yard smelled of, a smell she had come to associate with something that was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. She slipped it over her shoulders. It fit exactly. It fit the way a thing fits when it has been made for the specific person who is wearing it, with the knowledge of who that person is and what they have done and what they are going to do, and the weight of it settled across her shoulders, and she stood in the center of the Oakland chapter's compound in Bakersfield, California, 14 years old, wearing leather over a faded shirt, with a motorcycle key in her fist and the embroidered words "Blood Protector" positioned directly over her heart. The yard erupted. All 50 men simultaneously, the sound of it going up into the October sky like something physical. The roar of approval and recognition that these men reserved for moments that met the standard they had spent their lives trying to maintain. Bottles raised voices carrying across the compound and out over the fence and down the street in a wave of noise that turned heads 3 blocks away and made the birds on the telephone wires lift off again. The same kind of scatter against the same kind of sky. Roe crossed the yard and hit Eli across the back with an open palm hard enough to stagger her, grinning the grin of a man who has decided that today is a good day, which it was. Someone started an engine, then another, then several more, the yard filling with the overlapping thunder of machines coming to life, and the sound of it was the same sound that had shaken the earth of Sunnyside Trailer Park 2 years and 1 week ago. The same mechanical roar that had rattled the siding of a single-wide trailer and sent the stray dog scrambling, but heard from inside it, now surrounded by it, it was not frightening at all. It was the sound of people who had claimed you. And there is no sound in the world quite like that. Danny came through this crowd and stood beside her. She did not say anything. She reached out and took Eli's wrist in her hand the way she had once gripped her father's pendant in the dirt behind the old gymnasium, with the same tight, certain grip of someone holding something they have decided to hold on to, and she stood beside her in the noise and the smoke and the October light and looked straight ahead. In the corner of the yard near the gate, Carol Mitchell stood with a cup of coffee that someone had brought her without being asked. She was watching her daughter stand in the center of 50 roaring men in her blood protector vest, with the key to a rebuilt motorcycle in her fist and Danny Davidson's hand on her wrist. She had her free hand pressed flat against her sternum, against the specific center of gravity that mothers develop. That point in the chest where everything they feel about their children lives and radiates outward. She was not crying. She had done her crying in the particular private way she did everything difficult in the small hours of the mornings, before the double shifts in the car in the driveway, with her hands in her lap. She had done it, and she was done with it, and what was left after it was this moment in a compound in Bakersfield on a Saturday in October, with the smoke rising and the engines running, and her daughter standing in the center of all of it, visible, no one claimed. She took a sip of her coffee. Someone beside her said something she didn't catch, and she smiled in response. The smile of a woman who has set down a weight she has been carrying so long that the absence of it feels like a new kind of richness. The specific wealth of people who have come through something and arrived somewhere and can feel both of those facts at once. Eli Mitchell had started out as the invisible girl, the one who slipped between the cracks of a system that was not designed to catch her. The one who had learned invisibility as a survival strategy in a world that had organized itself around the assumption that people like her would remain invisible, would stay in their corner of the cafeteria, would keep their head down, would do the arithmetic of survival, and conclude that looking away was the only sensible calculation. She had done all of that arithmetic. She had sat at that corner table and eaten her free lunch and kept her bag on her lap and perfected the art of not being noticed. And then on a Friday afternoon in October, she had heard a voice crack in a dead zone corridor and had done the one thing that her entire careful architecture of survival had been constructed to prevent. She had looked. She had looked, and she had walked forward, and she had stood between three boys and one girl and said a single word out loud, and the word had cost her a cracked rib and a ruined face, and 3 days of unjust suspension, and the specific currency of a weekend spent watching her mother manage the math of an unpaid shift. And the return on that cost had been 50 men standing in a compound in Bakersfield on an October afternoon, making a sound like the end of something and the beginning of something else simultaneously. Sometimes the world is genuinely indifferent. Sometimes a person bleeds on a piece of cracked asphalt behind an old gymnasium, and nobody notices and nothing changes, and the physics of the world proceed as they were proceeding before. This is the more common outcome. It is important to say this because the alternative is a sentimentality that does not serve anyone. But sometimes, not always, not even often, but sometimes the thing you do when you think nobody is watching turns out to be the thing that everything else was waiting for. Sometimes you step in front of three boys on a Friday afternoon, knowing what it will cost you, knowing it clearly, and the cost turns out to be the price of entry into something larger than anything you could have purchased any other way. Eli Mitchell had paid that price at 12 years old with a cracked rib and a ruined face, and 3 days of suspension, and the specific dignity of a person who knows what she did and why she did it, and would do it again without hesitation. Because some things are simply not negotiable, not even when you have nothing in your pockets and nowhere to stand and the entire physics of the world is arranged against you. She was standing in it now. The weight on her shoulders was the right kind of weight, the kind that does not press you down but holds you upright, the kind that is not a burden but a foundation, the kind that you earn once and carry forward into everything that comes after. The engines ran, the smoke rose, the October light fell across the compound in long, flat angles that turned the chrome to fire. And Eli Mitchell stood at the center of all of it, with her key in her vest and her mother's smile, and Danny Davidson's hand on her wrist. And she was not invisible, and she was not afraid, and she was home.